What if the oldest story we know is not about gods descending to rule? What if the very first texts ever written describe something quieter, something sadder, something far more human than we've been told? Tonight, we return to the clay, to the pressed wedges in wet earth, to the voices that spoke before alphabets, before empires, before the idea of history itself, and in those marks, in those silent grooves worn smooth by 5,000 years, we find no triumph, no conquest, no divine right to dominate. Instead, we find exhaustion. We find need. We find beings who arrived on Earth not as masters, but as survivors of something already lost. This is not the story you've heard. This is the story written in the oldest language on Earth, and it has been waiting patiently for us to read it differently. So dim the lights if you can, let the room grow quiet, let your body settle, and let us return together to the beginning, not of the world but of memory itself. Before we begin this journey into deep time, if this kind of careful exploration speaks to you, if you value the slow unraveling of ancient meaning, consider liking this video or subscribing to the channel. Not as a demand, but as a quiet signal that this work matters to you. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. There is something strangely comforting in knowing that across the world, in different rooms, in different hours, people are hearing the same ancient words and finding the same strange peace. Now, let us go back beyond memory, back beyond the edge of what we can see. In the beginning, there was water, not the water we know, not rivers or lakes, or the rain that falls and ends. This was water without boundary, water that had no opposite, water that was everything, because nothing else had yet been named. The Sumerians called this Abzu, the deep, the source, the infinite stillness beneath the world, and in that water there was no separation, no sky distinct from earth, no light opposed to dark. There was only the vast undifferentiated presence of everything that might one day become something. Imagine it. Not as an ocean, because oceans have shores. Not as a void, because voids suggest absence, but as a state before difference itself. A moment so early that even the idea of a moment had not yet formed. And then, slowly, something changed. Not through violence, not through will, but through a kind of ancient inevitable separation. The sweet water and the salt water began to part. Abzu and Tiamat, the fresh and the bitter, the generative and the resistant. And in that parting, in that first quiet division, the world began to breathe. The Sumerian cosmology does not begin with a bang. It begins with a whisper, with the slow recognition that things which were once unified must now exist separately. And in that separation, there is already a kind of loss, already a memory of wholeness that can never be restored. The gods were born into this new separation, not as creators but as children of the water. Anu, the sky, Enlil, the air, Enki, the deep waters and the earth's hidden knowledge. They were not eternal, they were not all-powerful, they were born, they had parents, they had origins. This is important. The Mesopotamian texts do not describe omnipotent beings who exist outside time. They describe a hierarchy of emergence, where even the gods are subject to older forces, older powers, older waters. Anu rises into the heights, becoming the distant sky, the far-removed vault that watches but does not touch. Enlil takes the space between, the air, the breath, the force that separates heaven from earth and makes room for life. And Enki, the wise, the deep-seeing, the one who understands patterns and systems, descends into the waters beneath the world. Each of these gods represents not a personality but a function, not a character, but a cosmic role, and it is Enki who will matter most to our story, because Enki is the one who solves problems. Enki is the one who organizes. Enki is the one who understands that survival requires structure, labor, and the careful arrangement of resources. Enki does not rule through strength. He rules through knowledge, and in the Sumerian worldview knowledge is not power, knowledge is burden, but there is another name in these texts, a name that does not appear in the highest cosmology, a name that comes later, lower, more specific, Anunnaki, the children of Anu, the offspring of the sky. In some texts they are called the great gods, in others they are judges of the dead, In still others, they are workers, organizers, beings tasked with shaping the earth and managing its resources. And here is where the modern confusion begins, because we have taken this word, Anunnaki, and built an entire mythology around it. We have imagined them as invaders from distant stars, as ancient astronauts, as reptilian overlords, as architects of human slavery. But the texts do not say this. The texts do not describe arrival from the stars. They do not describe fleets descending. They do not describe conquest. What the texts describe is presence. Presence without explanation. Presence without origin story. The Anunnaki are simply there in the early world, performing tasks, organizing labor, managing the distribution of the Earth's resources. And if we read carefully, if we resist the urge to insert modern science fiction into ancient clay, we begin to see something different. We begin to see exhaustion. There is a text called the Atrahasis. It is one of the oldest continuous narratives in human history, written in Akkadian, but drawing from far older Sumerian sources. And in the Atrahasis, the gods are not celebrating, they are complaining. The Anunnaki, these so-called great gods, are digging canals, they are dredging rivers, they are clearing fields, they are hauling earth and stone, and they are tired. The text is explicit about this. The work is hard, the work is endless, the work is breaking them. For 40 years the Anunnaki labor, day and night, without rest, without relief. They cry out, they protest, they demand that something change. And this is not the language of conquerors, this is not the language of beings who arrive to dominate a primitive world. This is the language of necessity, of beings who need something from this place, who cannot simply leave, who must make this world work, because there is no alternative. One Sumerian tablet describes the Anunnaki as carrying baskets of earth. Another describes them as suffering under the weight of their tasks. These are not metaphors for power. These are images of labor, of burden, of a group working together not because they wish to, but because they must. And if we allow ourselves to sit with this image, if we let it unfold slowly in our minds, we begin to ask a different question. Not why did they come to conquer Earth, but why did they need Earth so desperately in the first place? The texts do not explain this directly. They do not offer a single passage that says, "We came from a dying world, and this is why we are here." But the absence of triumphalism is its own kind of evidence. When cultures describe conquest, they celebrate it. They write victory hymns. They describe the overthrow of the previous order. They name the defeated. They claim the spoils. The Sumerian texts do none of this. There is no mention of a native population being displaced. No mention of a war for control. No mention of Earth being taken by force. Instead, there is only the quiet, relentless description of work being done, of systems being built, of an environment being slowly, painfully organized into something livable. And woven through these descriptions, faint but undeniable, are references to something lost, something left behind, something that could not be saved. In some texts, the gods speak of the heavens as distant, unreachable. Anu, the sky, Father, is described as remote, withdrawn, untouchable. He does not descend. He does not intervene. He watches from a place so far removed that even the other gods cannot easily reach him. This is not the behavior of a thriving pantheon. This is the behavior of separation, of a connection that has been severed. And the Anunnaki, children of Anu, are described as being on Earth, not in the heavens, not travelling between worlds, but here, permanently, functionally, with no mention of return. There is a weight to this, a sadness. These are not beings passing through. These are beings who have arrived and cannot leave, and the more we read, the more we sense the shape of what is missing. The texts do not say the homeworld was destroyed. But they do not need to. The silence itself is the evidence, the fact that there is no return, no reinforcement, no contact, only the ongoing, grinding labour of making a new world work. And then, at the height of their exhaustion, the Anunnaki make a decision. They go to Enki, the wise one, the problem solver, and they demand relief. They cannot continue, the work is too much. Something must change, and Enki, in his deep and patient way, proposes a solution. He will create a worker, a being designed to carry the burden, a creature formed from clay and divine essence, shaped specifically to labour in place of the gods. This being will be called Lulu, the mixed one, the first human. And here, in this moment, we arrive at the heart of the misunderstanding. Because modern retellings describe this as the creation of slaves, as genetic engineering, as the cold manipulation of a primitive species for exploitative purposes. But the text does not use that language. The text describes necessity, cooperation, a solution born not from cruelty, but from the recognition that survival requires adaptation. The gods are failing. The work must continue. And so a new kind of being is made, one suited to this world in ways the Anunnaki are not. Humans are not described as property. They are described as necessary, as the answer to an impossible problem. And if we allow ourselves to imagine this moment not through the lens of science fiction invasion narratives, but through the lens of survival, the story transforms. It becomes tragic. It becomes profound. It becomes the story of refugees creating the very thing that will outlast them. The creation of humanity in the Atrahasis is not a triumphant act. It is an act of desperation. Enki mixes clay with the blood of a slain god, a god whose name means intelligence, whose essence carries memory and understanding. This is not crude engineering. This is the transfer of something sacred, something vital. The mixture is placed in the wombs of goddesses, because even creation requires labor, requires time, requires the slow biological process of becoming. 14 birth goddesses carry the first humans, 7 male, 7 female. And when they are born, they are not slaves. They are workers. They are partners in survival. The text describes them as taking up the baskets the gods had carried, as digging the canals the gods had dug. But there is no language of force, no language of chains or domination. There is only the quiet redistribution of labor, the recognition that this world requires beings who are suited to it, who can endure it, who can thrive in conditions the Anunnaki cannot. And slowly, gradually, the gods withdraw, not in anger, not in triumph, but in the quiet exhaustion of those who have finally found a way to rest. Consider what this means. Consider the implications hidden in the grammar of these ancient lines. The Anunnaki did not arrive with technology to transform Earth into a paradise. They arrived and found Earth harsh, difficult, demanding. The texts describe the early world as wild, unformed. The rivers had to be dredged by hand. The fields had to be cleared stone by stone. The irrigation systems had to be planned, constructed, maintained through endless labor. This is not the work of beings who possess advanced machinery. This is not the work of a civilization that can reshape planets with the push of a button. This is the work of beings using their hands, using their backs, using their knowledge, yes, but applying that knowledge through physical effort, through sweat, through the slow accumulation of infrastructure built one piece at a time. And if they possessed the means to simply return to wherever they came from, why would they stay? Why would they endure 40 years of canal digging? Why would they complain so bitterly about the burden? The only answer that makes sense is that they had no choice, that Earth, harsh and imperfect as it was, represented the only viable option, the only place left. There are fragments of other texts that hint at this same underlying reality. The Sumerian king list, for example, describes kingship descending from heaven, but the word used is not conquest, it is gift, it is transference, as if what was once held elsewhere is now given to Earth, not because Earth is better, but because there is nowhere else for it to go. The list describes impossibly long reigns, kings who ruled for thousands of years before the flood. And while modern readers dismiss these numbers as mythical exaggeration, there is another way to read them. What if these were not human kings at all? What if these were the Anunnaki themselves, managing the early cities, organizing the first attempts at civilization, living through long spans of time because they were not subject to the same swift decay that governs human life? And what if those long reigns ended not because the kings chose to step down, but because they simply faded, because their numbers dwindled? Because survival, even for gods, is never guaranteed. The word Anunnaki itself carries meaning we have forgotten. Anu is the sky, the high, the distant. Kai is the earth, the low, the near. Anunnaki then means those who are of heaven but who, placed upon the earth, those who belong to the heights but are found in the depths. This is not a name of power. This is a name of displacement, of beings who are between, who are no longer where they should be. And in Sumerian culture, names were not arbitrary. Names described function, described essence. To be called Anunnaki was to be identified as fundamentally out of place, as beings whose presence on Earth was itself a kind of exile. Whether that exile was chosen or forced, the texts never say, but the name itself suggests that it was not where they were meant to be. And here we must pause and consider the nature of memory itself. Because these texts, these clay tablets pressed in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, are not the originals, they are copies, copies of copies, transcriptions of oral traditions that stretch back even further into the mists of time before writing existed. The Sumerians themselves believed they were recording ancient knowledge, that the stories they told had been passed down from the very dawn of human awareness. And if that is true, if these narratives preserve memories from the earliest days of human civilization, then we must ask what those first humans actually witnessed. What did they see that made them describe beings labouring in the fields, organising cities, teaching the arts of irrigation and agriculture and governance? The modern mind wants to insert aliens, spacecraft, genetic laboratories. But the texts describe none of this. They describe teachers, organisers, beings who knew how to make the land productive and who taught humans to do the same. And if we strip away the need for sensationalism, if we sit quietly with what the texts actually say, we are left with something stranger and more tragic than invasion. We are left with the image of survivors passing on the knowledge that might allow a younger species to avoid the same fate. Think of it this way. Imagine you are part of a small group. Your world, wherever it was, whatever it was, is gone. You cannot return. You cannot call for help. You arrive on a planet that is habitable, yes, but barely. It has water. It has soil. It has life. But it is not organized. It is not structured. It requires immense effort to make it support even a small population. You begin the work because you must. You dig, you build, you plant, and slowly, over decades, over generations, you begin to fail. The work is too much. Your numbers are too few. You are exhausted. And so you make a decision. You will create helpers, not slaves, not servants, but beings who are suited to this world in ways you are not. Beings who can endure the heat, the cold, the disease, the short, brutal lives that physical labour demands. And you teach them. You give them the knowledge you have, the systems you have built, the techniques you have developed, not because you are benevolent gods, but because you need them to continue what you can no longer finish. This is not a story of power. This is a story of legacy born from necessity. The texts describe the Anunnaki as judges in the underworld, as beings who weigh the dead and determine their fates. And this role too is revealing. Because judges do not create law from nothing. Judges apply existing standards, existing codes. They represent continuity, the preservation of order across time. And if the Anunnaki were judging the dead, it suggests they were maintaining a system that predated their arrival on Earth. A system they brought with them. A moral and cosmic order that had to be preserved even in this new place, this refuge, this world that had not been their first choice. They were trying to recreate something, trying to maintain something, and that effort, that desperate clinging to old forms in a new world, is the behaviour of people who have lost their home and are trying to remember what home meant. There is a passage in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws heavily on Sumerian sources, where the gods gather to build Babylon. They work for a full year, carrying bricks, constructing the great temple that will become the centre of divine authority. And when the work is finished, they rest, they celebrate, they declare the city complete. But even in that moment of victory, there is an undertone of exhaustion, of relief that the work is done, not joy at what has been created, but relief that the labour has finally ended. This is not how conquerors speak. This is how builders speak. People who have carried too much weight for too long and are grateful to finally set it down. And if we read carefully, we notice that the gods do not claim to have built Babylon as a demonstration of power. They built it because they needed a place to be, a centre, a home. And the fact that they needed to build it at all suggests they did not arrive with one already prepared. As if what was once held elsewhere is now given to Earth, not because Earth is better, but because there is nowhere else for it to go. The list describes impossibly long reigns, kings who ruled for thousands of years before the flood. And while modern readers dismiss these numbers as mythical exaggeration, there is another way to read them. What if these were not human kings at all? What if these were the Anunnaki themselves, managing the early cities, organizing the first attempts at civilization, living through long spans of time because they were not subject to the same swift decay that governs human life. And what if those long reigns ended not because the kings chose to step down, but because they simply faded, because their numbers dwindled, because survival, even for gods, is never guaranteed. The word Anunnaki itself carries meaning we have forgotten. Anu is the sky, the high, the distant. Ki is the earth, the low, the near. Anunnaki, then, means those who are of heaven but placed upon the earth, those who belong to the heights but are found in the depths. This is not a name of power. This is a name of displacement, of beings who are between, who are no longer where they should be. And in Sumerian culture, names were not arbitrary. Names described function, described essence. To be called Anunnaki was to be identified as fundamentally out of place, as beings whose presence on Earth was itself a kind of exile. Whether that exile was chosen or forced, the texts never say, but the name itself suggests that it was not where they were meant to be. And here we must pause and consider the nature of memory itself, because these texts, these clay tablets pressed in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, are not the originals. They are copies, copies of copies, transcriptions of oral traditions that stretch back even further into the mist of time before writing existed. The Sumerians themselves believed they were recording ancient knowledge, that the stories they told had been passed down from the very dawn of human awareness. And if that is true, if these narratives preserve memories from the earliest days of human civilization, then we must ask what those first humans actually witnessed. What did they see that made them describe beings labouring in the fields, organising cities, teaching the arts of irrigation and agriculture and governance? The modern mind wants to insert aliens, spacecraft, genetic laboratories. But the texts describe none of this. They describe teachers, organisers, beings who knew how to make the land productive and who taught humans to do the same. And if we strip away the need for sensationalism, if we sit quietly with what the texts actually say, we are left with something stranger and more tragic than invasion. We are left with the image of survivors passing on the knowledge that might allow a younger species to avoid the same fate. Think of it this way. Imagine you are part of a small group. Your world, wherever it was, whatever it was, is gone. You cannot return, you cannot call for help. You arrive on a planet that is habitable, yes, but barely. It has water, it has soil, it has life. But it is not organized. It is not structured. It requires immense effort to make it support even a small population. You begin the work because you must. You dig, you build, you plant, and slowly, over decades, over generations, you begin to fail. The work is too much. Your numbers are too few. You're exhausted. And so you make a decision. You will create helpers, not slaves, not servants, but beings who are suited to this world in ways you are not. Beings who can endure the heat, the cold, the disease, the short, brutal lives that physical labour demands. And you teach them. You give them the knowledge you have, the systems you have built, the techniques you have developed, not because you are benevolent gods, but because you need them to continue what you can no longer finish. This is not a story of power. This is a story of legacy born from necessity. The texts describe the Anunnaki as judges in the underworld, as beings who weigh the dead and determine their fates. And this role too is revealing. Because judges do not create law from nothing. Judges apply existing standards, existing codes. They represent continuity, the preservation of order across time. And if the Anunnaki were judging the dead, it suggests they were maintaining a system that predated their arrival on Earth. A system they brought with them. A moral and cosmic order that had to be preserved even in this new place, this refuge, this world that had not been their first choice. They were trying to recreate something, trying to maintain something, and that effort, that desperate clinging to old forms in a new world, is the behaviour of people who have lost their home and are trying to remember what home meant. There is a passage in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws heavily on Sumerian sources, where the gods gather to build Babylon. They work for a full year, carrying bricks, constructing the great temple that will become the centre of divine authority. And when the work is finished, they rest, they celebrate, they declare the city complete. But even in that moment of victory, there is an undertone of exhaustion. of relief that the work is done. Not joy at what has been created, but relief that the labour has finally ended. This is not how conquerors speak. This is how builders speak. People who have carried too much weight for too long and are grateful to finally set it down. And if we read carefully, we notice that the gods do not claim to have built Babylon as a demonstration of power. They built it because they needed a place to be, a centre, a home. And the fact that they needed to build it at all suggests they did not arrive with one already prepared. The relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity, as described in these texts, is not one of worship and submission. It is transactional, functional. The gods need food, they need offerings, they need the products of human labour to sustain themselves, and in exchange they provide protection, organisation, the maintenance of cosmic order. This is not the relationship between masters and slaves. This is the relationship between two groups who need each other, who have formed a partnership born from mutual necessity. The gods are not described as omnipotent. They are described as dependent. They need the grain that humans grow. They need the bread that humans bake. They need the beer that humans brew. Without human labour, the gods would starve. And this dependency is stated openly, without shame, throughout the Mesopotamian corpus. The gods are powerful, yes. They have knowledge humans lack. They can perform acts humans cannot. But they are not self-sufficient. They are not complete unto themselves. They need this world. They need its resources. And they need the beings who know how to extract those resources most efficiently. And what of the humans in this arrangement? The texts describe them, not as suffering under divine tyranny, but as living within a system that makes sense to them. They work the fields because fields must be worked. They build the temples because temples provide structure, community, a focal point for collective effort. They bring offerings to the gods because the gods represent the forces that allow civilization to function. The river must flow, the sun must rise, the seasons must turn. And in the ancient mind, these forces were not abstract. They were personal. They were beings who could be addressed, petitioned, bargained with. The gods were not distant and unreachable. They were present. They were involved. They were part of the daily fabric of existence. And if we understand the Anunnaki not as alien overlords, but as the last remnants of a lost people trying to survive, then the entire dynamic shifts. The temples were not built to glorify tyrants. They were built to house refugees. The offerings were not tributes extracted by force. They were contributions to a shared survival effort. This does not mean the system was fair. It does not mean there was no exploitation, no suffering, no inequality. But it means the system was not designed as conquest. It was designed as cooperation between two groups who had no other options. There is a Sumerian poem called the Lament for Ur. It describes the destruction of the great city of Ur by invading forces. And in that lament, the gods are described as weeping, as abandoning the city not out of anger but out of helplessness. They cannot stop what is happening. They cannot protect the people who have served them. They can only watch as everything they built is torn down. This is not the behaviour of omnipotent beings. This is the behaviour of limited beings. Beings who have power, yes, but not ultimate power. Not the ability to shape reality according to their will. They are subject to forces beyond their control. They are vulnerable, and in their vulnerability they are profoundly human. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that humans, in their vulnerability, are profoundly like the gods. Because both are trying to survive. Both are building in the shadow of forces that could destroy them at any moment. Both are doing the best they can with what they have. Let us turn now to the question of why the Anunnaki appeared divine to early humans, because this is perhaps the most important part of the story, the part that explains how survivors became gods, how refugees became the architects of myth. Imagine you are a human in the 4th millennium before the Common Era. You have never seen writing. You have never seen a city. You have never conceived of agriculture as a systematic practice. Your life is governed by the rhythms of the natural world. You hunt, you gather, you move with the seasons, and then you encounter beings who can do things you cannot imagine. They can predict the movements of the stars. They can measure the flooding of the rivers. They can organize hundreds of people to work together on projects that span years. They can write. They can calculate. They can build structures that will stand for generations. To you, these abilities are not technology. They are magic. They are divine. Because the gap between what you know and what they know is so vast that it cannot be explained by mere difference in education or experience. It must be explained by difference in nature. They must be gods, not because they claim to be gods, but because you have no other framework for understanding what they are, and the Anunnaki, exhausted and desperate as they were, did not refuse this interpretation. They accepted it. They allowed themselves to be worshipped, not because they believed they were divine, but because divine authority was the only form of authority that would work in this context. If they presented themselves as simply more knowledgeable humans, their authority would be questioned, their decisions would be debated, their systems would be resisted. But if they presented themselves as representatives of cosmic order, as beings who understood the will of heaven, then their authority became unchallengeable. This was not deception. This was survival. They needed humans to follow their instructions, to dig the canals where they said to dig them, to plant the crops when they said to plant them, to organize into cities and accept hierarchies and contribute to collective projects. And the easiest way to ensure compliance was to frame these instructions as divine commands. Not lies, not manipulation. But the use of the only language that would work in that context. Over time, the distinction between what the Anunnaki were and what humans believed them to be began to blur. The Anunnaki themselves may have forgotten, across the long generations, that they had ever been anything other than gods. Their children, born on Earth, knowing no other world, would have no memory of the place their ancestors came from. They would only know the stories, the myths, the accounts that had been passed down and distorted and embellished over centuries, and those accounts would describe beings of immense power and wisdom who shaped the world according to their will, not because that was the truth, but because that was the story that made sense, that gave meaning to the arrangement. That explained why some beings commanded and others obeyed, and yet, beneath the mythology, beneath the divine titles and the temple rituals and the cosmic hierarchies, the original relationship remained. The Anunnaki needed Earth because they had nowhere else to go. They needed humans because they could not do the work alone. And humans needed the Anunnaki because the knowledge they possessed, the systems they had developed, allowed for a kind of life that would not have been possible otherwise. Cities, irrigation, writing, law, astronomy. These were not gifts from benevolent gods. These were tools of survival shared by one struggling group with another. And if we can see past the mythological overlay, if we can read the texts with fresh eyes, we find not a story of divine right, but a story of collaboration forged in the crucible of necessity. There is a text known as the Sumerian instructions of Shuruppak, one of the oldest pieces of wisdom literature in existence. In it, a father gives advice to his son, and the advice is intensely practical. Do not steal, do not lie, do not buy a donkey that brays too much, work hard, be respectful. These are not the commands of a god. These are the instructions of someone trying to teach another person how to survive in a difficult world. And if Shuruppak, one of the antediluvian cities ruled by kings of impossible age, was a place where the Anunnaki still walked among humans, then this text may preserve something of their actual voice. Not the voice of divine proclamation, but the voice of tired wisdom. Of beings who have seen too much and are trying to pass on. What matters? Be honest. Work hard. Do not waste resources. These are the concerns of people who know how fragile survival is, how easily it can be lost. The texts also describe conflicts among the gods. Enlil and Enki do not always agree. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, is ambitious and unpredictable. Nergal descends to the underworld and claims rulership there. These are not the stories of a unified divine authority. These are the stories of a fragmented group, of individuals with different priorities, different methods, different visions for how things should be organized. And this too makes more sense if we understand the Anunnaki as survivors rather than conquerors. Because survivors are never unified. Survivors are traumatized. They carry the weight of what they have lost. They argue about how to move forward. Some want to preserve the old ways, others want to adapt. Some are cautious, others are reckless, and the tensions between them shape the world they are trying to build. The Mesopotamian pantheon is full of these tensions. Gods competing for influence, gods forming alliances, gods betraying one another. This is not the behavior of cosmic abstractions. This is the behavior of people. People under immense pressure. People trying to survive. And then, slowly, across the long centuries, the presence of the Anunnaki begins to fade. The texts from the earlier periods mention them frequently. They are active. They are involved. They are making decisions and issuing decrees and shaping the course of events. But as time progresses, as human civilization grows more complex and more self-sufficient, the gods become more distant, more symbolic, more abstract. They are still worshipped, they are still invoked, but they no longer walk among humans. They no longer intervene directly. They have withdrawn to the heavens. Or perhaps more accurately, they have simply ceased to exist as physical presences. Their knowledge has been passed on, their systems have been established. Humans no longer need them in the way they once did. And so the gods fade, not through war, not through defeat, but through the quiet process of becoming unnecessary. This is the fate of all teachers, all organizers, all those who build systems meant to outlast them. They become invisible, they become myth, and eventually they are remembered not as they were, but as symbols of something larger. The texts never describe a great departure. There is no account of the Anunnaki leaving Earth en masse, no final goodbye, no closing of the gates of heaven. They simply appear less and less frequently in the records until eventually they are spoken of only in past tense. As beings who once were, who once shaped the world, who once mattered, and this gradual fading is perhaps the most compelling evidence that they were never conquerors, because conquerors leave marks, they leave ruins, they leave monuments to their dominance, but survivors leave only the systems they built and the knowledge they shared, and when those systems no longer require their presence, they disappear, not because they are defeated, but because their purpose has been fulfilled. In the later Babylonian and Assyrian periods, the Anunnaki are remembered primarily as judges of the dead, as beings who dwell in the underworld and weigh the souls of those who have passed. This is a far cry from the early texts where they are described as labourers and organisers, but it is a natural evolution. As the gods became more distant, more abstract, they also became more associated with the invisible, with the realm beyond death, with the forces that govern not the physical world, but the moral and spiritual order. And in this transformation, we can see the final stage of their journey, from physical beings performing physical labour, to distant authorities maintaining cosmic balance, to abstract principles governing the afterlife. They did not leave Earth. They dissolved into it. They became part of the conceptual architecture of human civilization, and in that dissolution, they achieved a kind of immortality, not as individuals, but as ideas. Modern interpretations have tried to reverse this process, to make the Anunnaki physical again, to insist that they were ancient astronauts with advanced technology, that they conducted genetic experiments, that they enslaved humanity for gold mining or genetic material or some other resource. And these interpretations are appealing because they are clear, they are dramatic, they fit the narrative structure we expect from science fiction. But they are not supported by the texts. The texts describe labour, not slavery. They describe cooperation, not domination. They describe beings who are struggling, not beings who are in control. And if we are willing to set aside our need for sensational explanations, if we are willing to sit with ambiguity and sadness, and the possibility that the truth is more tragic than exciting, then we can begin to see the Anunnaki for what the earliest sources suggest they were: survivors, refugees, the last remnants of something that came before, beings who arrived on Earth not because they wanted to conquer it, but because they had nowhere else to go. And what does this mean for us? What does it mean to reread the oldest texts on Earth and find not gods but survivors? It changes everything, because if the Anunnaki were refugees, then the foundation of human civilization was not built on conquest and domination. It was built on collaboration born from desperation. It was built by two groups who needed each other, who could not survive alone, and this changes how we understand power, how we understand authority, how we understand the relationship between knowledge and control. The Anunnaki had knowledge that humans lacked, but knowledge without labour is useless. Knowledge without hands to implement it, without bodies to do the work, is just theory, just potential. The gods needed humans to make their knowledge real, to turn their understanding of irrigation into actual canals, to turn their astronomical calculations into actual calendars, to turn their social theories into actual cities. And humans needed the gods to provide the framework, the vision, the long-term planning that comes from understanding systems at a level that only experience and education can provide. This is not a story of exploitation. Or rather, it is not only a story of exploitation, because yes, humans laboured, yes, humans suffered, yes, humans died building the irrigation systems and the temples and the cities that made Mesopotamian civilization possible, but they did not do this under the lash. They did this because the alternative was worse. The alternative was remaining hunter-gatherers in a world that was slowly becoming less hospitable. The climate was changing, the megafauna were disappearing, the easy resources were being depleted, and agriculture, despite its many hardships, despite the backbreaking labour it required, offered something that hunting and gathering could not. It offered stability, it offered surplus, it offered the possibility of accumulation and growth, and the construction of something that would last beyond a single lifetime. The Anunnaki did not invent agriculture to enslave humanity. They introduced agriculture because it was the only way to make Earth productive enough to support both populations, theirs and the humans they had created. Let us think carefully about this creation narrative, because it is not what we imagine when we think of genetic engineering or laboratory experimentation. Enki does not describe constructing DNA sequences. He does not describe microscopes or test tubes or controlled environments. He describes mixing clay with the blood of a slain god and placing this mixture in the wombs of goddesses who carry the first humans to term over the course of normal gestation. This is not technology. This is ritual. This is symbolic, language describing a process that the Sumerians understood through the lens of birth and creation and the mixing of essences. And if we take this language seriously, if we do not simply dismiss it as primitive metaphor, we have to ask what actual process this ritual might be describing. One possibility is that the Anunnaki were not creating humans from scratch. They were modifying existing hominids, taking creatures that already existed on Earth and elevating them, teaching them, organizing them, breeding them selectively for intelligence and cooperation, and the ability to perform complex tasks. This would not require advanced genetic technology. It would only require time, patience, and an understanding of how traits pass from parents to children. The clay represents the earth, the physical body, the material form that all living things share. The blood of the god represents consciousness, intelligence, the divine spark that separates thinking beings from animals, and the womb represents time, process, the slow development that cannot be rushed. If we read the creation narrative this way, it becomes a description not of instant manufacture, but of gradual cultivation. Of the Anunnaki spending generations teaching early humans, selecting the brightest, the most capable, the most willing to learn, and slowly, over time, creating a population that could understand language, follow instructions, plan for the future, and work together on projects that required sustained collective effort. This is not enslavement. This is education. This is the creation of culture. And yes, it was done for pragmatic reasons. The Anunnaki needed workers, but the result was the emergence of human civilization itself, of beings who could think abstractly, create art, develop religion, build cities, and eventually, long after the Anunnaki had faded into myth, create writing and science and philosophy, and all the other achievements that define our species. In this reading, humanity is not the victim of the Anunnaki. Humanity is the legacy of the Anunnaki. We are what they created when they knew they could not survive indefinitely. We are the answer to the question of what happens when survivors realize they are dying out and need to leave something behind. They could not save themselves, but they could create beings who would carry forward the knowledge they possessed, who would build on the foundations they established, who would eventually surpass them. And is this not exactly what the texts describe? The gods creating humans to perform the labor the gods can no longer perform, the gods teaching humans the arts of civilization, and then the gods fading away, becoming distant, becoming myth, as humans grow more capable and more independent. This is not the story of masters and slaves. This is the story of parents and children, of one generation preparing the next to survive in a difficult world. And yes, the relationship was complicated. Yes, there was exploitation and inequality and suffering. But there was also care, also transmission of knowledge, also the hope that what was being built would last. Consider the invention of writing. The Sumerians developed cuneiform, the first true writing system, around 3200 BCE. And what did they write? They wrote economic records, inventories of grain, lists of workers and their assigned tasks, records of temple offerings. This is not the work of slaves. This is the work of administrators, Are people managing complex systems that require accurate record keeping? And who taught them to do this? The texts suggest it was the gods, that writing was a divine gift, a tool passed from the Anunnaki to humans to allow for the maintenance of the systems the Anunnaki had established. And once humans possessed writing, once they could record information and transmit it across time and space without relying on memory alone, they no longer needed the gods in the same way. They could preserve knowledge themselves. They could build on previous generations' work. They could develop new techniques and new systems without requiring divine intervention. Writing made humans independent, and the gods, whether they intended this or not, had given humans the tool that would make the gods obsolete. The same pattern repeats with every other fundamental technology: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, agriculture, metallurgy. In every case, the texts describe these as gifts from the gods, as knowledge that humans did not discover on their own, but received through divine instruction. And in every case, once humans possessed this knowledge, they developed it further. They improved it. They adapted it to new circumstances. The gods provided the foundation, the basic principles, the starting point, but humans built the structure. And eventually the structure became so large and so complex that the foundation was no longer visible. The gods were buried beneath layers of human innovation and human achievement. And this is exactly what would happen if the Anunnaki were real beings who taught early humans and then faded away. Their direct influence would be limited to the earliest period, the foundational knowledge. But everything built on that foundation would be human work, human creativity, human adaptation to local circumstances and changing conditions. There is a Sumerian proverb that says, "When the gods made man, they kept immortality for themselves and gave death to humanity." This is usually read as a lament, as an explanation for why humans must die while gods do not. But there is another way to read it. The gods kept immortality means the gods did not reproduce successfully. They did not create a viable next generation. They were functionally immortal not because they could not die, but because they could not easily create new members of their species. Their numbers were fixed, limited, declining, and they gave death to humanity means they gave humans something the gods did not have: the ability to reproduce quickly, to replace losses, to adapt through generational change, to evolve. Death is not a curse in this reading. Death is the price of adaptability, of resilience, of the capacity to survive through constant renewal. The gods were static, unchanging, and because they could not change, they could not survive. But humans, precisely because they died, precisely because each generation was slightly different from the last, could adapt to Earth in ways the Anunnaki never could. The gods gave humans death, yes, but in doing so, they gave humans the future. We must also consider the flood narrative, because almost every ancient culture has a flood story, and the Mesopotamian version is one of the oldest. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in the earlier Atrahasis, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a great flood. The reasons vary slightly between versions, but the core motivation is consistent. Humans have become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. They are keeping the gods awake. They are consuming too many resources. They are upsetting the balance, and so the gods, led by Enlil, decide to wipe them out and start over. But Enki, the wise one, the problem solver, betrays this plan. He warns a man named Utnapishtim, or Atrahasis, or Ziusudra depending on the version. He tells him to build a boat, to save his family and representatives of all living things, to survive the flood and restart civilization afterward. And when the flood comes, when the waters rise and cover the earth and drown almost every living thing, Utnapishtim survives. And afterward, when the gods realize what has happened, they are not angry at Enki for his betrayal. They are relieved, because they have discovered something they did not anticipate. Without humans, they cannot survive. The gods gather after the flood and they are starving, because there are no humans to provide offerings, no humans to grow grain or brew beer or bake bread or tend the animals. The gods have destroyed their own food supply, and in their hunger, they crowd around Utnapishtim's sacrifice like flies, desperate for sustenance. This is one of the most revealing passages in all of Mesopotamian literature, because it shows, unambiguously, that the gods are dependent on humans, that they need us more than we need them, and if we read this as the story of survivors who created humanity out of necessity, the flood narrative becomes the story of a mistake, of the Anunnaki, in their frustration and exhaustion, trying to undo what they had created, trying to return to the earlier state when it was just them, struggling alone. But discovering that they had become too dependent on the system they had built, that they could no longer survive without the humans they had once laboured so hard to create. The flood is not divine judgment. The flood is divine panic, an attempt to regain control that backfires completely and reveals just how powerless the gods actually are. And Enki, in saving Utnapishtim, is not being kind. He is being pragmatic. He understands that without humans, the entire project fails. All the work, all the effort, all the centuries of building and teaching and organising will be lost. And so he preserves a seed, a remnant, the minimum viable population needed to restart human civilization. And he is proven right. Because after the flood, civilization does restart. Humans rebuild, they replant, they reorganize, and the gods, chastened by their near disaster, agree never to destroy humanity again. They recognize that they are stuck with us, that we are part of the system now, that our survival and theirs are linked. This is not a story of gods graciously sparing humanity. This is a story of gods realizing they have no choice. In the later traditions, the flood becomes a dividing line. There is the world before the flood, when the gods still walked the earth and kings reigned for impossible lengths of time. And there is the world after the flood, when kingship is re-established but humans are more clearly in charge. The dynasties after the flood have normal lifespans. A king reigns for 20 years or 40 years or 60 years, not thousands. This shift suggests that something changed after the flood, that the Anunnaki, having nearly destroyed their own support system, withdrew further from direct involvement. They allowed humans more autonomy, more independence, or perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps the flood represents the end of the generation that still remembered direct contact with the Anunnaki. Perhaps Utnapishtim and his family were the last humans to have seen the gods face to face, and everyone born after the flood knew the gods only through stories, through ritual, through the systems that had been established but no longer required divine presence to maintain. There is a profound loneliness in these texts, a sense of abandonment that runs through Mesopotamian religion. The gods are distant. They are unpredictable. They are often indifferent to human suffering. Prayers go unanswered, offerings are made, but the hoped-for blessings do not come. And the question that haunts so much of this literature is, why have the gods turned away? What did we do wrong? But if the gods were never omnipotent to begin with, if they were always just survivors trying to make the best of a bad situation, then their distance makes sense. Their silence makes sense. They are not turning away. They are simply gone. They faded. They died out. They left behind the systems they built and the knowledge they shared, but they themselves could not survive indefinitely. And humans are left worshipping beings who are no longer there to respond, building temples to house gods who no longer visit, making offerings to sustain beings who no longer need sustenance because they no longer exist. This is the tragedy at the heart of Mesopotamian religion. Not that the gods are cruel, but that the gods are absent. And humans cannot accept that absence, cannot accept that they are alone, and so they continue the rituals, continue the worship, continue to call out to beings who will never answer again. But here is the beauty hidden in that tragedy. Because even though the gods are gone, what they built remains. The cities remain, the agriculture remains, the writing remains, the laws remain, the astronomical knowledge remains. Everything that allows human civilization to function continues to work even without divine supervision. The systems are self-sustaining. They do not require the gods to maintain them. They only require humans who understand the principles and are willing to do the work. And this is the ultimate gift the Anunnaki gave us. Not just knowledge, not just technology, but autonomy. The capacity to survive and thrive without needing them. They created us to be their workers, but in doing so, they created us to be their inheritors. To carry forward not just their techniques, but their entire civilizational project. To build on what they started, to exceed what they could achieve, to become something they never were, independent, self-sufficient, free. And is this not exactly what has happened? 5,000 years after the last cuneiform tablet was pressed into wet clay, we are still using the base 60 number system the Sumerians developed for astronomical calculation. We are still dividing the circle into 360 degrees. We are still measuring time in units of 60 seconds and 60 minutes. We are still using the wheel they invented, the plough they designed, the urban planning principles they established. We are still writing, still calculating, still organizing ourselves into cities with hierarchies and laws and divisions of labor. Everything the Anunnaki introduced has been developed further, refined, adapted to new contexts, but the foundation remains. They are gone, forgotten except as myth. But what they built is still here, still, shaping how we live, still determining the basic structure of human civilization. They achieved immortality not as individuals, but as a civilization, as a set of ideas and techniques that became so fundamental to human life that we no longer even recognize them as inventions. We think of them as natural, as inevitable, as just the way things are. But they were invented, they were taught, they were passed down from beings who knew they were dying and wanted to leave something behind. There is a particular kind of sadness in reading these texts with fresh eyes, because once you see the Anunnaki as survivors rather than conquerors, every passage takes on new weight. Every complaint about labor becomes a cry for help. Every description of organizational effort becomes evidence of desperation. Every fading mention becomes a marker of decline. The texts are not celebrating divine power. They are documenting the slow extinction of a people who tried everything they could to survive and ultimately failed. Not completely, not without leaving a trace, but they failed to preserve themselves as a distinct group. They failed to maintain their presence as physical beings walking the earth. And in that failure, paradoxically, they succeeded in creating something far more durable than themselves. They created us. Think about the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is the oldest known work of literature, and at its heart it is a meditation on mortality. Gilgamesh, the king who is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, cannot accept death. When his friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is devastated. He embarks on a quest to find immortality. He travels to the ends of the earth. He crosses the waters of death. He finds Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, the only human granted eternal life by the gods, and Gilgamesh demands to know the secret. How can I live forever? How can I escape death? And Utnapishtim tells him the truth. You cannot. The gods made one exception once, and they will never do it again. Death is the fate of all living things. Even the gods will eventually fade. Nothing lasts forever. And Gilgamesh, heartbroken, returns home. He does not achieve immortality. But he does achieve something else. He builds. He constructs the walls of Uruk. He organizes his city. He creates something that will outlast his physical body. And the epic ends with the narrator inviting us to look at these walls, to see the achievement, to recognize that this not eternal life is how we defeat death. We build, we create, we leave something behind. This is the lesson the Anunnaki learned. This is the lesson they passed down to us. You cannot live forever, but you can create things that will. You can teach people who will teach others. You can establish systems that will function long after you're gone. You can plant seeds you will never see grow to full height. And in doing so, you achieve the only immortality that matters, not the persistence of your body, but the persistence of your influence, your ideas, your contribution to the ongoing project of civilization. The Anunnaki are dead, have been dead for millennia, but every time we write, every time we calculate, every time we organize ourselves into complex social structures, we are continuing their work. We are their immortality. Now let us address directly the question of why modern interpretations have gone so far astray. Why have we transformed survivors into invaders? Why have we added spacecraft and genetic laboratories and gold mining operations to stories that never mentioned any of these things? The answer lies in our own cultural moment. We live in an age of science fiction, an age where technology has advanced so rapidly that we have come to believe that any sufficiently advanced civilization must possess capabilities that seem magical to us. Faster than light travel, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology. And when we look back at ancient texts describing beings with knowledge beyond human understanding, we automatically insert our own technological fantasies. We assume that advanced knowledge must mean advanced technology, that beings who could organize cities and predict celestial movements must have possessed machines beyond our comprehension. But this is projection. This is us imposing our own worldview onto people who thought very differently. The Sumerians did not conceive of technology the way we do. They did not separate natural from artificial. They did not imagine that knowledge could be embodied in machines rather than in people. For them, power came from understanding, from wisdom, from the ability to see patterns and relationships that others missed. Enki was powerful not because he had tools, but because he was clever, because he could solve problems, because he understood how things worked at a fundamental level. And this kind of power, this intellectual and organizational power, is exactly what a group of survivors would possess. They would know things that primitive humans did not. They would understand agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, law, governance. They would be able to organize large groups of people toward common goals. They would seem godlike not because they had technology, but because they had knowledge. And knowledge transmitted through teaching and example is exactly what the texts describe. The ancient astronaut theory, popularized in the 20th century, assumes that ancient humans were too primitive to develop civilization on their own, that they needed outside intervention, extraterrestrial guidance. But this assumption is both insulting and unnecessary. Humans are clever. Humans are creative. Humans are capable of remarkable achievements given time and motivation and the right circumstances. We do not need aliens to explain the pyramids or Stonehenge or the Nazca lines. We only need to acknowledge that ancient people were just as intelligent as we are. What they lacked was not brain power, but accumulated knowledge. And accumulated knowledge takes time to develop. It requires generations of experimentation, failure, refinement, and transmission. The Anunnaki, if they existed as the texts suggest, did not build civilization for humans. They gave humans a head start. They provided foundational knowledge that would have taken humans much longer to develop independently. But everything built on that foundation was human work. Consider agriculture again. The domestication of plants and animals is an incredibly complex process. It requires understanding genetics at an intuitive level, understanding which traits are heritable and which are not, understanding how to selectively breed for desired characteristics over multiple generations. Modern agricultural science has shown just how sophisticated this process was. The wild ancestors of wheat and barley look nothing like their domesticated descendants. Corn was bred from a grass called teosinte that bears almost no resemblance to modern maize. These transformations required thousands of years of careful selection, observation, and cultivation. And yet the Mesopotamian texts describe agriculture as appearing relatively suddenly, as being introduced rather than gradually developed. One possible explanation is that the Anunnaki, coming from a place where agriculture had already been developed, brought domesticated plants with them, or brought the knowledge of how to domesticate plants, and shared this knowledge with humans, allowing the process to happen much faster than it would have through independent discovery. This would not require genetic engineering in the modern sense. It would only require seeds and knowledge and time. The same logic applies to every other foundational technology. Writing did not appear in its full form overnight. The earliest Sumerian writing was pictographic, simple drawings representing objects. Over time, these drawings became more abstract, more stylized. They developed into the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. This evolution is visible in the archaeological record. We can trace the gradual development, but what we cannot explain easily is why writing developed in Mesopotamia first. Why not China? Why not the Indus Valley? Why not Mesoamerica? All of these regions developed writing eventually, but Mesopotamia was first. One possible answer is that Mesopotamia was where the Anunnaki were, where their influence was strongest, where they introduced the concept of recording information in permanent form, and once the concept was introduced, once humans understood that marks on clay could preserve information across time and space, they developed it further. They adapted it. They refined it, until it became something far more sophisticated than whatever the Anunnaki had initially shown them. But there is another possibility we must consider, one that is perhaps even more radical than the survivor hypothesis. What if the Anunnaki were not a separate species at all? What if they were simply an earlier human civilization, a group that had achieved significant advancement before some catastrophe destroyed their world and forced the survivors to flee? This would explain everything the texts describe without requiring beings from another planet. It would explain their vulnerability, their exhaustion, their need for Earth. It would explain why they could interbreed with humans and produce offspring, why they needed food and rest and shelter, why they died. If the Anunnaki were human, or proto-human, or a related species, then the creation of humanity as described in the texts might be describing something else entirely. Not the creation of a new species, but the integration of two populations, the survivors and the natives. The mixing of the refugees' advanced knowledge with the local population's adaptation to Earth's environment. And the result would be us, modern humans, carrying genetic and cultural heritage from both groups. This interpretation finds some support in the texts themselves, because the gods are not described as alien. They look like humans, they speak human languages, they have human emotions, they form human relationships, they eat human food. The differences between gods and humans are described as matters of degree, not kind. The gods are taller, stronger, longer-lived, more knowledgeable, but they are not fundamentally different. They are not described as having strange anatomies or exotic biologies. They simply seem like enhanced humans. And if the Anunnaki were a more advanced human population, this makes perfect sense. They would have better nutrition, better medicine, better living conditions. They would live longer and grow taller as a result. They would have knowledge accumulated over many generations, but they would still be recognizably human, still subject to the same basic needs and vulnerabilities. The flood narrative gains new meaning in this interpretation, because catastrophic floods did occur in human prehistory. When the last ice age ended, sea levels rose dramatically. Coastlines that had been dry land for thousands of years were submerged. Entire regions were flooded. If there was an advanced human civilization living in what is now the Persian Gulf, which was dry land during the Ice Age, they would have been forced to flee as the waters rose. They would have become refugees, and they would have carried with them whatever knowledge and skills they possessed. They would have arrived in the highlands of Mesopotamia as survivors of a world-destroying catastrophe, and they would have integrated with the local population, teaching them, organizing them, creating the foundations of what would become Sumerian civilization. The flood in the texts would not be a divine punishment sent to destroy humanity. It would be the actual historical event that destroyed the Anunnaki homeland and forced them to start over in a new place. This interpretation is speculative. We have no archaeological evidence of an advanced civilization in the Persian Gulf basin before it was flooded. But we also have very little evidence from underwater sites. The technology to explore submerged coastlines is relatively recent, and the work is difficult and expensive. It is entirely possible that remnants of such a civilization exist beneath the waters of the Gulf, waiting to be discovered. And if they are ever found, they might vindicate the survivor hypothesis in a way that is both more mundane and more profound than the ancient astronaut theory. More mundane because it would not require extraterrestrial intervention. More profound because it would mean that everything we attribute to divine teaching was actually human achievement. That our ancestors, unaided by gods or aliens, developed agriculture and writing and civilization through their own intelligence and effort. And that the stories of divine intervention are simply the way later generations made sense of the rapid advancement that occurred when two populations, one more advanced and one more adapted to local conditions, merged their knowledge and capabilities. But whether the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial survivors, human refugees from a lost civilization, or some other explanation we have not yet conceived, the core insight remains the same. They were not conquerors. They were not invaders. The texts do not describe domination. They describe collaboration born from necessity. They describe beings who needed Earth and beings who needed knowledge working together to create something neither could have achieved alone. And that collaboration, that partnership, however unequal it may have been, gave birth to civilization itself, to writing and law and urban life and all the structures that define human society. The Anunnaki gave us the tools. We built the house, and now we live in that house so completely, so naturally, that we have forgotten it was ever built, at all. We think of civilization as inevitable, as the natural state of human existence. But it is not natural. It is constructed. It is the result of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and effort. And it began, if the texts are to be believed, with survivors teaching refugees how to turn a harsh and unforgiving world into a home. There is one more element we must examine before we can bring this journey to a close, and that is the question of why this matters. Why does it matter whether the Anunnaki were conquerors or survivors? Why does it matter how we interpret texts that are 5,000 years old? It matters because the stories we tell about our origins shape how we understand ourselves. If we believe civilization began with conquest, with powerful beings subjugating weaker ones, then we accept domination as natural, as inevitable, as the way things have always been and always will be. But if we believe civilization began with collaboration with different groups, needing each other and working together despite their differences, then we see a different possibility. We see that power does not have to mean domination, that knowledge does not have to mean control, that it is possible for the strong to teach the weak without enslaving them, for the wise to guide the inexperienced without exploiting them, for different peoples to merge their capabilities and create something greater than either could achieve alone. The Anunnaki, whether they were aliens, lost humans, or something else entirely, faced a choice. They were failing. They could not survive through their own efforts alone. They could have responded to this failure with violence, with conquest, with the enslavement of the primitive humans they encountered. And some interpretations insist that this is exactly what they did. But the texts do not support this reading. The texts describe a different choice, the choice to create partners, to share knowledge, to build systems that would benefit both groups. Yes, there was inequality. Yes, humans did most of the physical labor. Yes, the gods maintained positions of authority and privilege. But the relationship was reciprocal. The gods needed human labor. Humans needed divine knowledge. And together they created civilization. This is a hopeful story. A story that suggests cooperation is possible even between radically different groups. Even when power is unequal. Even when resources are scarce and survival is uncertain. We live in a time when this lesson is desperately needed, when human civilization faces challenges that cannot be solved by any single nation or culture or ideology acting alone. Climate change, pandemic disease, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence. These are civilizational problems. They require cooperation on a scale humanity has never before achieved. And they require us to believe that such cooperation is possible, that we can work together despite our differences, that we can share knowledge and resources and build systems that benefit everyone rather than enriching the few at the expense of the many. The story of the Anunnaki, properly understood, gives us a model, not a perfect model, not a model without flaws or suffering or exploitation, but a model that shows cooperation is possible. That knowledge can be shared, that different groups can come together and create something enduring. And there is something else, something deeper. The Anunnaki failed to save themselves. Despite all their knowledge, despite all their efforts, they could not survive as a distinct people. They faded, they disappeared, they became myth. But they did not fail completely, because what they built outlasted them. The systems they established continued to function. The knowledge they shared continued to be developed. The civilization they helped create continued to grow and spread and evolve long after they were gone. They achieved immortality not by living forever, but by making themselves obsolete, by creating beings who could carry forward their work without needing them. This is the ultimate act of generativity, the ultimate expression of hope, to build something knowing you will not be there to see it completed, to teach people who will surpass you, to accept your own mortality and work toward a future you will never inhabit. This is what parents do, what teachers do, what all of us must do if we want to leave the world better than we found it. We plant trees we will never sit under. We solve problems that will only become fully apparent after we are gone. We invest in futures we will never see. And the Anunnaki, if they were real, if they truly walked the earth and labored alongside early humans and slowly faded into legend, gave us the clearest possible example of this principle. They did not live forever, but what they built did. They did not maintain control, but what they taught spread across the entire world and became the foundation of every civilization that followed. They disappeared, but we remain, carrying their knowledge, building on their foundation, continuing their work, and in that continuation, they are not dead. They are merely transformed, changed from physical beings into ideas, into principles, into the very structure of human thought and human society. Let us return now to the clay itself, to the physical tablets that preserve these stories, because there is something profound in the medium as well as the message. Clay is earth. It is mud mixed with water and pressed into shape by human hands. It is the most basic, most fundamental material. And when you press a reed stylus into wet clay, you leave a mark, a permanent mark. Once the clay dries, once it hardens, the mark remains. It can survive for thousands of years. It can outlast empires. It can speak across the vast gulf of time with perfect clarity. The Sumerians understood this. They knew they were creating something permanent, something that would endure. And what did? They choose to preserve not just king lists and temple inventories, not just economic records and legal contracts. They also preserved stories, myths, poems, wisdom literature. They preserved the things they thought mattered most, the things they wanted future generations to know. And among those stories, woven through all of them, is this narrative of the Anunnaki, of beings who came before, who established order, who taught and organized and built, and who gradually faded until only their influence remained. The Sumerians were not writing propaganda. They were not creating fiction for entertainment. They believed these stories were true. They believed they were preserving actual history, the history of how their world came to be, how their cities were founded, how their civilization began. And if we take them seriously, if we read their words with the respect they deserve, we cannot simply dismiss their testimony. We cannot say they were primitive and confused and making things up. We must consider the possibility that they were describing something real, something that actually happened, even if we cannot fully understand it, even if it challenges our assumptions about history and human development. The archaeological record supports the idea that something unusual happened in Mesopotamia around the 4th millennium BCE. Civilization appeared rapidly, too rapidly for the slow accumulation model we usually apply to human development. Within a few centuries, we go from scattered farming villages to full cities with temples, palaces, writing, complex social hierarchies, and sophisticated irrigation systems. This is not impossible through purely human effort, but it is unusual. It suggests either that development was happening faster than we expect, or that knowledge was being transmitted from somewhere, either through contact with a more advanced group or through the rediscovery of knowledge from an earlier period. The Sumerian texts themselves insist that knowledge came from the gods. That civilization was not invented but received. And while we can dismiss this as religious belief, we can also ask what actual events might lie behind that belief. There is a concept in archaeology called the urban revolution. It describes the transition from small farming communities to large cities, and this transition, wherever it happened, brought with it a cascade of changes: specialization of labor, social stratification, centralized authority, monumental architecture, writing, mathematics, organized religion. All of these elements appear together. They form a package. And this package appeared first in Mesopotamia, then in Egypt, then in the Indus Valley, then in China, then in Mesoamerica. Each civilization developed these elements independently, or so we believe. But there are remarkable similarities, similar architectural forms, similar organizational structures, similar symbolic systems, similar mathematical principles. Are these similarities simply the result of universal human psychology, of different groups independently arriving at similar solutions to similar problems? Or is there some connection we have not yet identified, some transmission of knowledge across vast distances and time periods? The survivor hypothesis offers one possible explanation. If a group with advanced knowledge arrived in Mesopotamia and taught the fundamentals of civilization, and if some of that knowledge later spread to other regions through trade, migration, or cultural contact, it would explain the similarities. It would explain why certain ideas, like the 7-day week, or the division of the circle into 360 degrees, or the concept of a written legal code, appear in multiple civilizations, not because each group invented these things independently, but because they all inherited them, directly or indirectly, from a common source, the Anunnaki. Or whoever the Anunnaki actually were. This does not diminish human achievement, because humans took these basic concepts and developed them in radically different directions. Egyptian civilization looks nothing like Sumerian civilization in its particulars, even though both share fundamental organizational principles. Chinese civilization developed its own unique character while still using mathematical and astronomical knowledge that may have originated elsewhere. Each civilization was a unique expression of human creativity. But all of them may have been working from a common foundation, a foundation laid by survivors who had no choice but to share what they knew. Now we must consider what happened to the Anunnaki themselves, because the texts are clear that they faded, that their presence diminished over time, that they became less involved in human affairs, less visible, less relevant. And eventually they disappeared entirely, remaining only as objects of worship and myth. There are several possible explanations for this fading. The first and most obvious is that they died out. If the Anunnaki were a small population of refugees, they would have faced all the problems small populations face: limited genetic diversity, difficulty reproducing, vulnerability to disease. Even if individual Anunnaki were long-lived, as the texts suggest, they were not immortal. They aged, they died. And if their birth rate was low, each death would represent a significant loss. Over generations, over centuries, the population would shrink. The knowledge would become concentrated in fewer and fewer individuals, and eventually the last of them would die, leaving only the systems they had built and the humans they had taught. A second possibility is that they integrated, that over time the boundaries between Anunnaki and humans became blurred. The texts mention children of gods and humans, hybrid beings. If the Anunnaki and humans could interbreed, and if they did so regularly, then after several generations there would be no pure Anunnaki left, only descendants carrying varying amounts of Anunnaki heritage. These descendants might have retained some of the knowledge, some of the abilities, some of the longevity of their divine ancestors, but they would have been fundamentally human, part of human society, no longer separate, no longer distinct. The gods would not have disappeared. They would have been absorbed, diluted, transformed through mixture until they ceased to exist as a separate category. This would explain why later texts describe demigods and heroes, beings who are greater than ordinary humans but less than full gods. These might be the descendants of mixed unions, the last remnants of Anunnaki heritage expressing itself in human bodies. A third possibility is that they left, that at some point when human civilization was self-sustaining, when their presence was no longer necessary, the remaining Anunnaki departed, went somewhere else. Return to the heavens, not as a metaphor but as an actual place. This is the interpretation favoured by ancient astronaut theorists, that the Anunnaki were always extraterrestrial and eventually returned to their homeworld or travelled to another planet. But the texts do not describe a departure. There is no narrative of the gods leaving Earth. There is only their gradual absence, their slow fading from active involvement to passive observation to mere memory. This pattern suggests death or integration rather than departure. If they had left deliberately, if they had said goodbye and ascended to the heavens in a visible way, surely the Sumerians would have recorded it. Surely there would be stories of the great departure, of the gods returning to their proper realm. But there are no such stories. Only silence. Only the slow recognition that the gods no longer answer, that the temples are empty, that the offerings go uneaten. Perhaps all three explanations are partially true. Some died, some integrated, some few might have left, though where they would go and why remains mysterious. The net result was the same. The Anunnaki as a distinct group ceased to exist, and humanity was left alone, no longer guided by divine wisdom, no longer organized by divine authority, forced to rely on our own judgment, our own knowledge, our own efforts. And we rose to the occasion. We took the systems they had taught us and improved them. We took the knowledge they had shared and expanded it. We took the cities they had helped us build and made them greater. We exceeded our teachers. We surpassed our creators. We became something they never anticipated, not just workers, not just inheritors, but innovators in our own right, builders of a civilization that would span the globe and reach beyond Earth to touch other worlds. And in this surpassing, we honored them, because the greatest gift a teacher can give is to create students who exceed them. The greatest achievement of any civilization is to inspire civilizations that go further. The Anunnaki, if they could see what we have become, would recognize their influence. They would see the agriculture we still practice, though we have mechanized and genetically modified it beyond anything they could imagine. They would see the cities we still build, though they now house millions instead of thousands. They would see the writing we still use, though it has evolved from clay tablets to paper to digital screens. They would see the mathematics we still employ, though we have extended it into realms of abstraction they never conceived. Everything we are rests on the foundation they provided. But we have built a structure so vast, so complex, so magnificent, that the foundation is no longer visible. It is buried deep beneath layers of human achievement, and that is exactly as it should be. There is a particular passage in the Sumerian poem Inanna's Descent to the Underworld that has always struck me as deeply significant. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, decides to visit the underworld, to descend into the realm of death, and as she passes through each of the 7 gates, she must remove a piece of her divine regalia, her crown, her necklace, her robe. One by one, her symbols of power are stripped away until she arrives in the presence of Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, naked and powerless, and Ereshkigal kills her, hangs her corpse on a hook like a piece of meat. Inanna, the mighty goddess, is defeated, destroyed, made nothing, and she hangs there, dead, for 3 days and 3 nights until Enki, the wise one, sends helpers to revive her. This story is usually read as a seasonal myth, Inanna's death representing winter, her resurrection representing spring. But there is another way to read it, as a description of what happens when gods descend to earth. When they leave their proper realm, they are diminished, stripped of power, made vulnerable, and eventually they die, unless they are saved, unless something intervenes to resurrect them. But what if there was no resurrection for the Anunnaki? What if they descended to earth and were stripped piece by piece of everything that made them divine? Their knowledge shared and thus no longer exclusive, their authority questioned and thus no longer absolute, their longevity insufficient to outlast the slow march of generations. What if they hung, metaphorically, in the underworld of Earth, dead but still remembered, waiting for a resurrection that never came? And what if we, humanity, are that resurrection? Not of the Anunnaki themselves, but of their project, their vision, their hope that intelligence could survive catastrophe, that knowledge could transcend death, that something could be built that would last. We are their resurrection, their return to life in altered form. We are what grows from their grave. This is not a metaphor. This is how culture actually works, how knowledge actually transmits, how civilizations actually endure. The individuals die, the specific forms pass away, but the patterns persist. The ideas survive, the systems continue, and each generation builds on what the previous generation left behind, creating something new while preserving the essential core. The Anunnaki planted seeds in soil that was not their own, in a world that was not their home, and those seeds grew into something vast and strange, into a forest they would not recognize. But the DNA of those original seeds is still there, in every tree, in every branch, in every leaf. We are the forest that grew from their planting. We are the strange and beautiful result of their desperate gamble. We are proof that their sacrifice was not in vain. And what of the tablets themselves? The clay records that preserve these stories? They too are survivors. Most of them were not preserved intentionally. They survived because they were buried, because they were in buildings that burned, and the fire baked the clay harder, making it more durable, because they were in cities that were abandoned and covered by desert sand, because they were forgotten and thus protected from the destructive hand of people who might have destroyed them as heretical or useless. They survived by accident, by chance, by the simple fact that clay, once baked, is nearly indestructible. And now, 5,000 years later, we dig them up, we clean them, we translate them, we puzzle over their meanings, we argue about their interpretation, and in doing so, we bring the Anunnaki back to life, not as physical beings, but as presences in our consciousness, as questions we must answer, as challenges to our understanding of history. The tablets speak to us across the vast gulf of time. They tell us things we have forgotten, things our own historical records do not preserve, things that happened so long ago that they have passed beyond the reach of normal historical inquiry. And they tell us that we are not the first, that civilization did not begin with us, that there were others before us who struggled and suffered and achieved remarkable things, who faced challenges we can barely imagine, who survived disasters we can only guess at, and who left us, deliberately or accidentally, the tools we needed to build something greater than they could achieve. This should humble us, because it means we are not the pinnacle of achievement, we are not the end point of progress, we are simply the latest link in a very long chain, and what we build now will serve as foundation for those who come after us, just as what the Anunnaki built served as foundation for us. There is one final element we must address, and that is the emotional content of these texts. Because beneath the stories of gods and heroes, beneath the accounts of creation and flood and civilization, there runs a current of feeling that is unmistakably human. Grief, loneliness, the ache of loss, the weight of responsibility, the fear of being forgotten. These emotions saturate the Mesopotamian corpus. The lament for Ur is heartbreaking in its sorrow. The Epic of Gilgamesh is devastating in its confrontation with mortality. The creation myths are heavy with the burden of existence. These are not the cold accounts of alien beings describing their conquest of a primitive world. These are their passionate expressions of people who feel deeply, who love and hate and hope and despair, who understand what it means to lose everything, who know what it costs to survive. And if the gods in these stories are described as feeling these emotions, as weeping and raging and mourning and celebrating, it is because the people who wrote these texts understood those emotions, because they had felt them, or because they had heard them described by beings who had felt them, by the Anunnaki themselves, by survivors who carried the weight of a lost world. Imagine being the last of your kind, knowing that when you die, everything your people were will be lost, knowing that no one will remember your language, your customs, your stories, your songs, knowing that you will be forgotten completely as if you never existed. This is the terror that haunts all dying cultures, the desperate desire to preserve something, anything, to leave a mark that will endure, to teach someone who will remember. And if the Anunnaki faced this terror, if they knew they were dying out and could not stop it, then their efforts to teach humanity take on a different character. They were not enslaving us. They were begging us to remember them, to carry forward what they had learned, to make sure their knowledge did not die with them. And we did. We remembered, not accurately, not completely, not in the way they might have hoped, but we remembered. We wrote down their stories, we preserved their names, we kept alive, however distorted the memory of their presence. And now, thousands of years later, we are still trying to understand who they were and what they meant. And so, we arrive at the end of this long meditation, at the quiet place where all journeys into deep time must eventually rest. We have travelled back through 5,000 years of silence. We have read the oldest words written by human hands. We have considered what they say and what they do not say. We have tried to see past our own assumptions, our own cultural biases, our own need for simple explanations. And what have we found? Not gods descending in glory to claim dominion over a primitive world. Not alien conquerors mining Earth for resources and enslaving humanity. Not genetic engineers coldly manipulating DNA to create a servant race, but something quieter, something sadder, something infinitely more human. We have found the story of survivors, of beings who lost everything and came to a strange world and tried to make it home, who worked until their bodies broke, who taught because they had no other way to preserve what they knew, who created partners because they could not survive alone, and who faded slowly and inevitably into myth and memory. This is not the story we expected. It is not dramatic in the way we have learned to expect from our movies and our novels. There are no space battles, no laser weapons, no vast conspiracy spanning millennia. There is only labour and exhaustion, and the slow recognition that despite all efforts, survival is not guaranteed, that even gods can die, that even the wisest can be forgotten, that everything built will eventually crumble unless someone else chooses to maintain it. And this is a more powerful story than any invasion narrative could ever be, because it is true to the actual human experience. It reflects what we know about how civilizations rise and fall, how knowledge is transmitted and lost, how the work of one generation becomes the foundation for the next, how nothing lasts forever except the patterns we pass down. The Anunnaki, whoever they were, whatever they were, faced the same challenge every civilization faces, the challenge of meaning in the face of mortality. If we are going to die, if everything we build is going to eventually decay, why build at all? Why struggle? Why suffer? Why try? And the answer the Anunnaki found, the answer preserved in these ancient texts, is that we build because building is how we defeat death. Not by living forever, but by creating things that will, by teaching people who will teach others, by planting seeds we will never see grow to full height, by accepting that we are temporary, but what we make can be permanent. This is the great wisdom at the heart of Mesopotamian religion, the wisdom that the gods themselves had to learn, that power is not in domination but in legacy, that immortality is not in the persistence of the body, but in the persistence of influence, that the only thing that truly lasts is what we give away, and we, humanity, are what the Anunnaki gave away. We are their legacy, their monument, their message to a future they would never see. Every city we build echoes the first cities they helped establish in the marshlands of southern Iraq. Every field we cultivate remembers the first fields they taught us to irrigate. Every word we write carries the ghost of the first words pressed into wet clay by hands that are no longer human, if they ever were. We are the living continuation of their story, the proof that their efforts mattered, that their suffering was not meaningless, that refugees can become founders, that survivors can build something that outlasts their survival. This is the gift they gave us, not technology, not power, but hope. The hope that even when everything is lost, even when the world you knew is gone forever, even when you are exhausted and afraid and certain you will fail, you can still build something, you can still teach someone, you can still plant seeds, and those seeds might grow into forests you will never walk through, into civilizations you will never inhabit, into futures you cannot imagine. So what should we do with this knowledge? How should we hold this story? Not as absolute truth, because we cannot know with certainty what happened 5,000 years ago, in the time before reliable history. But not as mere myth either, because myths are not lies. Myths are truths told in the only language available. They are attempts to preserve memory across spans of time so vast that literal accuracy becomes impossible. They are the shapes that facts take when they pass through the filter of generations. And if the Sumerian texts are myths, they are myths that point to something real, something that happened, something that mattered so much that people felt compelled to write it down and preserve it even when they no longer fully understood what they were preserving. We should hold this story gently, with respect for those who first told it, with humility about our own ability to interpret it correctly, and with openness to the possibility that our ancestors knew things we have forgotten, that they witnessed things we can barely imagine, that they were not primitive but different, not ignorant but possessed of different knowledge, not confused but trying to describe experiences we have no framework for understanding. And we should let this story change us. Let it challenge our assumptions about power and civilization and the relationship between knowledge and authority. Let it remind us that we are not self-made, that everything we have, everything we are, rests on foundations laid by others, by our parents and teachers and ancestors, by everyone who came before us and struggled and suffered and built and taught and passed down what they learned. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and some of those giants, perhaps, were the Anunnaki, were survivors from a lost world who gave us the tools to build our own world, who taught us how to survive, who showed us that even in the face of impossible loss, creation is still possible, legacy is still possible, hope is still possible. This is what the texts tell us if we read them carefully, if we set aside our need for spectacular explanations and our desire to feel superior to our ancestors, if we simply listen to what they are saying. The Anunnaki were not gods, and they were not invaders, they were survivors, and they survived through us. And now, at the end of all this, we return to silence, to the quiet darkness where all stories eventually rest. The tablets have been read, the interpretations have been offered, the ancient words have spoken across the gulf of time, and we have done our best to hear them clearly. And what remains is not certainty but wonder, not answers but better questions, not the end of mystery, but its deepening. Because the more we learn about the past, the stranger it becomes. The more we uncover, the more we realize how much has been lost, how much we will never know, how many voices have been silenced forever, how many stories have crumbled back into the earth from which they came. We are fortunate to have these tablets, these fragments, these whispers from the deep past. They are gifts from people who wanted to be remembered, who hoped that someday someone would find their words and understand. And we are trying. Across 5,000 years we are trying to understand. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the act of trying, the act of listening, the act of taking seriously what our ancestors said, is itself a form of resurrection. A way of bringing the Anunnaki back to life, if only for a moment, in our thoughts, and our conversations and our attempts to imagine what they experienced. So let the world grow quiet now. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. You have travelled far tonight, back through time, back through memory, back to the very beginning of recorded history. And you have found not certainty but possibility, not one truth but many potential truths, Not gods or aliens or simple explanations, but the far more interesting reality of human experience in all its complexity and tragedy and hope. The Anunnaki, whoever they were, are gone. They have been gone for thousands of years, but what they built remains, what they taught continues, what they hoped for has been realized in ways they could never have imagined. They survived through us. And perhaps that is the greatest achievement any civilization can claim, not to last forever, but to create something that will, not to rule eternally, but to give knowledge that will spread and grow and transform into new forms, not to be remembered as they were, but to be remembered at all. And tonight, here, in this moment, we remember them. Not as gods, not as invaders, but as survivors, as builders, as teachers, as beings who faced the end of everything they knew and chose despite their exhaustion and their grief, to begin again. And in that beginning, they gave us our own beginning, our own chance, our own opportunity to build and teach and hope. And so we honor them best not through worship but through continuation, through doing what they did, building what will outlast us, teaching what we have learned, planting seeds we will never see grow. This is their legacy, and this is our inheritance. And this is how the story continues, generation after generation, from their hands to ours, and from our hands to those who will come after, forever building, forever teaching, forever surviving, until the last light fades and even memory itself returns to silence. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it? Where you are? Leave a comment below and let us know. There is something beautiful in knowing that across the world, people are hearing these ancient words and feeling the same quiet wonder, the same connection to the deep past, the same recognition that we're all part of something much larger and older than ourselves. Sleep well, dream of deep time, and remember that we are all survivors, all inheritors, all builders of futures we will never see. The Anunnaki understood this, and now perhaps so do we.